So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our TrustedSec webinar today. We'll be discussing the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. We really appreciate everyone joining and looking forward to a broad conversation about the CMMC. So could you, Nathan, switch slides? So a couple things. This webinar is being recorded. If you are registered, then you'll receive an email when the recording is available. Full replay will be available on our YouTube page. And any questions throughout can be entered on the Q&A function, which you'll see down there at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to ask questions anytime. We're going to be watching those throughout, and we'll do our best to answer those the best we can. Nathan, next slide. So a little bit about our TrustedSec. So we've been around a while now. A lot of you are very familiar with us, I would hope. Our mission is really to change the industry for the better. One of the ways that we do that to support our customers as well as the broader community is by supplying a lot of different tools and tactics and information and support if you're ever struggling with a particular issue. You know, with the number of consultants we have, it's almost without question, you know, someone here will have an answer or have some experience with it or be able to point you in the right direction. And we really are happy to do that and really enjoy doing that. There are a number of areas that you can see on the screen, you know, where we provide services, a lot of different consulting services. Today we'll be focusing on the CMMC, but we have a lot of interest in other areas as well. So please feel free to reach out to us. Additionally, we have a remediation function where we're able to help you know, our customers not just assess things, but also implement them as well. So my name is Alex Hammerstone. I am the GRC, Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance Practice Lead at TrustedSec. I've been here about 7 years now. I'm privileged to be able to work with all different types of clients across all different kinds of verticals, performing assessments, program building, things like that. I'm always interested in you know, making new relationships and meeting people out there, so please reach out anytime. Also joining us is Rick Yoakum, who's a principal security consultant. Rick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Rick Yoakum. I've been with TrustedSec for about 2 years. Prior to that, held a variety of roles, several of which had to do with building or assessing organizations that have CUI. And if you don't know what I mean by CUI, then this webinar is definitely for you. With that, I'll throw it to Steve.
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Steven Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here. Been in security for quite a while now, 15 years, 22 years in IT. Worked a lot on digital transformation, the security engagements, really helping companies securely enable a better workforce experience or customer experience or that type of thing. Happy to be here. So I'll get us started. Oh, go ahead.
I'll say just a quick note, you know, one of the great things about this company is I've known Steve for a decade, and so kind of at the point where we can finish each other's sentences, which hopefully you'll be able to hear some of that today. And you know, and Rick and I work very closely together on a number of engagements, so it's really a pleasure to be able to talk with both of them today.
Well, thank you. So we always like to get started with just, you know, some background information, and anytime we're talking to the government, you really have to start with the background on acronyms. There's just so many of them. So these are typically used quite often in regard to the CMMC. So the first one is federal contract information. That's provided by or for government and contracts. So basically, it's, you know, it's just not intended for public release. The controlled and classified information is really the focus of the CMMC and the NIST 800-171 before it. It, of course, excludes information that is classified. And then there's controlled technical information for military and space applications, you know, technical data, software, that type of thing. And those need to be marked specifically, and that is determined by the Department of Defense, what those are. A couple others on the system security plan. We'll go into some of the components you'll need to have for that. As well as the C3PAO, not the C3PO. And it is really what the organizations are going to be doing coming forward. You'll need to have a third-party accreditation or assessment to ensure that you are compliant. There are none of these yet. There are going to be assessors in the future. They're still determining the criteria and how that will roll out. And then we also have the segregation of duties, ensuring no one person is handling conflicting duties or has control over a whole process. A few others, there's the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, the DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and the Code of Federal Regulation. So put a link in there in a little bit on some of the other definitions that we've been able to go through. So Rick, what constitutes CUI?
So CUI is a bunch of things, and it's probably helpful to have just a little bit of history on how CUI even kind of came about. Several years ago, the government realized that its different agencies, different groups within it had several different classification schemes for classifying information. And these entailed different terminology for sensitive stuff, different labeling practices, et cetera. So they embarked on a project to align all that stuff, because having it disassociated from each other was making it difficult for agencies to share information, essentially. So when they went through this project, they actually found that some organizations obviously protect more information than other organizations, and they needed this new classification of data, essentially, because there's this data that's not classified, but for some reason or another, certain agencies want it to be protected. And so they developed this thing called CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information. It's a whole bunch of basically ancillary stuff, like I mentioned, that's not classified but needs to be protected for various legal reasons. And you can really find the definition on that in the NARA, on the NARA website. NARA is the National Archives and Records Administration. So if you don't know what the heck this stuff entails, go here. It's a bunch of stuff from nuclear information to budgetary information to technical specifications. And oftentimes it's very, very specific in terms of what you actually need to protect. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So let's move on to the next slide. So they figured out they have this CUI, and they figured out all these ways that they want to protect it, because again, it's not classified, but it does need some additional protection. And they implemented that throughout the various government agencies. And then they realized, oh, but we work with a ton of third parties, and we need to make sure they're protecting this information just as much as we, the government, are protecting the information. So what are we going to do? Well, they had NIST create a document called 800-171. And essentially, it's how non-governmental entities should be protecting this CUI. The way this sort of rolled forward was primarily through self-assessments, although there have been a couple audits of large organizations. It is still the active standard, so CMMC isn't active yet, although they are encouraging organizations to start to think about it and get ready for it. But 171 is still what applies to you if you have CUI. But the challenge with this, and the reason that CMMC kind of came about, is because that self-policing thing left a lot of areas of interpretation, whether it was interpretation in terms of what does or does not constitute CUI, or interpreting whether or not specific controls were in place or not in place or partially in place. And ultimately, the government sort of realized, well, forcing our third parties to sort of self-regulate here isn't working out as much as we want it to. So they developed the CMMC to get into to start to address that. And Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I started. I went to the NIST Cybersecurity conference in November of 2018, and a big theme there was supply chain was sexy, and probably was a precursor to what we're seeing within the CMMC. There are over now 350,000 vendors in the DoD supply chain, so pretty big chunk of companies. And the intent of it is really to combine the various control standards, starting with the NIST 800-171, but then also expanding to some of the controls in 800-53, ISO, other ones, the CERT, resilience management model, things like that. So wanted to have it into one unified standard for cybersecurity. So, and what's kind of different about this, and what's kind of nice, which we'll see, is in addition to those control standards, it also measures the maturity of a company's, what they call institutionalization of cybersecurity practices and processes. So all companies conducting business with the DoD or within that supply chain must be certified. Again, right now there isn't any certification, but there will be, typically they're expecting towards the end of the year or beginning of next with everything that's gone on. So, and the level is really going to depend on the amount of CUI you handle or process. The CMMC audits won't be applied to classified systems. Those have other regulations applied to those. And it's broken down into a couple of different things. So some of the information, there's quite a bit of course. The model main is the overview of the CMMC. The model appendix really has the grid as well as the deeper explanation and all the verbiage around the different controls that are in it. And one last thing to note, once you get a CMMC certificate, it's going to be valid for 3 years. So that's kind of a nice thing as well. You can, get it one time and be ready to go for 3 years. So moving on to some of the details of it, or how it's broken down. It's broken down into the first, of course, the model itself. And then there are domains, those high-level areas we'll touch on in a bit within security. And those are broken down into both processes and capabilities, and then practices. So processes are really generalized to all the domains, and they revolve around things such as planning, reviewing, measuring, things like that. They're not the controls themselves, but it really shows how well your program is running. So again, it's more formally the institutionalization of those processes. So capabilities are then just a group of practices, and practices are really when you get down into the nitty-gritty. The practices are those controls or safeguards that are actually put into place. So where the practice is essentially the to-dos with specifics grouped to form a capability, such as limit physical access. What do we have to do to capably limit physical access, as an example? So those practices are ordered by both domain and then maturity level. And then the capabilities are, again, just a subgrouping. So you'll notice when we move forward, they're really not using the NIST cybersecurity framework tiers. And what was interesting from that conference, the feedback in the presentations, a lot of them around the lunch tables, et cetera, was that executives were much more familiar with maturity, and it was easier to understand, and support is a measurement. People got that pretty well immediately. So there wasn't too much more that they needed to do. So instead of using the tiers, which had hit or miss adoption within the cybersecurity framework itself, you can really see a little bit why they kind of did that. The capability maturity model, which the CMMC is built up for the maturity of the processes, was actually started by companies that worked in the DoD and funded the Software Engineering Institute to develop it. So the term maturity relates to, quote, the degree of formality and optimization of processes. So you move from, in essence, ad hoc to formally defined steps, to managed result metrics, and active optimization of the processes. So when you get asked how mature are you, it's now twofold. You have both those processes and the controls within it, whereas before you would have just had the controls. And so it's nice in that it gives you a better understanding of how well you're managing those processes, within the controls or in and around the controls. They also have their own set of processes and practices across each domain. In other words, they have to build up. So you can't be a level 3 without doing a level 1, as an example. So each one builds upon the others. And the maturities are, of course, initial, managed, defined, quantitatively managed, and optimizing. So the CMM capability maturity model is slightly different. And so that hygiene is, in essence, dental hygiene, the assumption that all good cyber hygiene practices have, another layer of protection over and above it. So in the level 1, for example, they have things that are equivalent to all the practices within the federal acquisition regulations. So all those contracts and things. So different types of things that go into that. And those are a little bit less stringent than what's in level 3, which includes, again, all of the NIST 800-171 in addition to a few others. So the levels in focus, which we'll get into, shows, okay, well, how mature do we have to be? Well, of course, it depends on what you're doing. So level 1, as I was saying, it's safeguarding the federal contract information. And as I was saying earlier, if you're level 1, what's kind of nice about that is you have something that you can show your third parties or show your companies that you work with, that you can say that we are compliant with the Department of Defense Cybersecurity Model Certification specifications to safeguard federal contract information, FCI. So it sounds pretty legit, sounds pretty good, and it at least shows that you're doing certain basic safeguarding things as you're moving towards full compliance. And that's pretty nice because in a lot of cases, it was either all or nothing. You're either compliant or not. Now you at least have one step that you can say and put out to the world that you're doing more, or you're doing something, or you're on your way. And then again, just make sure you're saying compliant and not certified, or you can say you're meeting the intent of the CMMC standard. Again, no one's certified yet. So pretty much at it. And then as you move along, you're doing increasing protection of the CUI. And then, once you get to that optimization, are you doing it across different, if you have divisions, et cetera.
Well, thanks, Steve. So just to clarify what the heck this thing looks like when you do dig into it a little bit, as we mentioned before, or Steve mentioned, the first big chunk that things are divided into are domains. And, if you're familiar with NIST stuff or really almost any cybersecurity or compliance framework, a lot of this stuff should look pretty familiar to you. These are just the big buckets that controls are being grouped into. So flip it to the next slide and we'll see the actual capabilities. So within each one of those domains, you have these capabilities. And if you come from more of a audit type perspective, you can kind of think of these capabilities as control objectives. So high level groupings of the things that we want to accomplish within each one of those domains. So breaking it down even further on the next slide will be the practices themselves. And these are the individual controls. So then within each one of those, kind of control objectives, or as they talk about it, capabilities, you have level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5 controls, level 1 controls as well, although this domain has no level 1 controls, which is part of the reason why we wanted to show it. It is worth just touching on the fact that not every capability has controls at every level. But essentially you can see that, each control is uniquely identified with an identifier and then just some language around what that thing entails, what it is you need to do. So going to the next slide really quickly, from an evidentiary perspective, there's sort of two things here, and this touches on sort of the multi-dimensional aspect of this that Steve was talking about before. On the one hand, you need to be doing all those controls that are broken into the capabilities that are part of the domains. And that's kind of one side of the tower. And on the other side of the tower, you need these fundamental governance and oversight things, depending on what level you need to be. So level 1, you actually don't need any of these things. You could be theoretically certified at level 1 without any documentation, as long as you're doing all the level 1 controls. But once you start to move up that chain, if you want to be level 2, for instance, you're going to need some level of policies and procedures to codify all the controls that you're executing, in addition to doing all the level 1 controls and all the level 2 controls. When you move up to level 3, you need kind of what we think of internally as an operational control index. Most organizations are going to see this as a formalized system security plan, or SSP. And this needs to detail, we'll get into a little bit later, some of the stuff, but at a minimum, this operational control index really needs to include who owns the control, at what frequency is it being performed, and what are the high-level procedures for execution, and the high-level procedures for documentation of the performance of the control. So more than just policies that say we have to do something, you're starting to get into the how we do that something. As you move to level 4, again, in addition to all the controls, level 4 and above, you need sort of this oversight control index. And again, this is something that's usually built into an SSP if that's the direction you're going. But essentially, this is very similar to your operational control index in terms of how you execute things, but this is all about the oversight of those controls, right? So who's watching, making sure that things are being performed, at what frequency is oversight being performed, how are controls being evaluated, how are problems being escalated, what's the formal channels for remediation, all those things. And then level 5 organizations actually don't need additional documentation in this area. What they need is that documentation to be aligned in this very specific way. So if you are a large organization with a bunch of different business units, a level 5 organization is really asking for that sort of level 1, 2, 3, and 4 evidentiary things, right? Your SSPs, control indexes, policies and procedures, but they want them to be somewhat aligned and standardized across your divisions and business units, so those expectations are matched, and so that you're achieving kind of economies of scale in terms of regulatory oversight, monitoring, orchestration, process integration, all those types of things. So I think with that, there might be a few questions we're going to jump into. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah. So I will put them up there, ask you guys and answer a few. So first one is, do you believe this model will eventually be extended to non-DoD companies as a best practice, much like NIST, CSF, CIS, security controls, etc.? Right now, and I'll go with that one, just they don't expect that it's going to be pushed past the DoD, at least for the foreseeable future. But I would say that what's, again, nice about it is it does have those different maturity levels. It does show something. You can say you're, in essence, compliant to it. And, whereas, again, in this CSF, if you're saying you can sort of be, audited or self-audited to it if you'd like. But in this way, it's kind of nice because it does have those different levels. It is probably going to have it's going to definitely have an audit. And it's going to have different levels that you'll be able to achieve. So while I don't think they're going to extend it, meaning you're not going to have audits, it still would be a good practice to look at these controls in addition to the CSF. The only challenge is some of the things are a little bit onerous, so you'll have to determine the applicability there. But it is a nice framework in the way that they're laying it out in the process that they're laying it out.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I wouldn't expect any requirements around this to be rolled out, but just in terms of adoption, the CSF and the CIS controls are generally, frequently adopted by a lot of organizations. And when that's not the case, organizations often will have other sort of compliance type frameworks they want to align to, whether it's PCI or HIPAA or all those other things, depending on your industry and business practices. So I'd be a little surprised if organizations took it upon themselves to sort of self-regulate to this. But, like many compliance frameworks, there's a ton of overlap between this stuff and, the stuff in those other control frameworks. So while a lot of organizations probably won't align to it directly in terms of specific how they use the levels and documentation and things like that, I think there probably are some organizations that'll, take a look at what they're doing today, and they might take a look at the controls in this framework just to make sure there's nothing special or additional that they want to be doing.
And I think I would add to that a little bit too is, every standard out there, there's always going to be some company that will just want to use it as a guide because everyone's always looking for a place to start. In my experience, I've even seen companies that don't have any payment card data, choose to follow PCI as kind of the DSS as kind of just a good starting point and something to work from. So, kind of reiterate, I wouldn't see it being required by anybody, even by contracts, picking this as the standard to use. But, it certainly is just another thing that if people decide they want some place to start, some place to align their information security program outside of the context of, any DoD relationship or CUI, that they very well may, choose something like this and use it in that way.
Great. Another question, should information systems sold to DoD and used by DoD in DoD premises implement CMC controls and practices? We'd like to go with that one.
So my understanding is that, if we're talking about sort of like the internal agency side of things, Yeah, they should be using it already as part of the sort of self-policing internal to the government of how they need to be protecting their own CUI. So there should already be process in place for that. From a CMMC perspective, I would not be surprised at all to see in those contracts of products being sold to, to DoD or being used by, services that are supporting the DoD, requiring stuff like this in the future. Alex, is that your thought as well?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
We have been, another one, we have been driven by regulatory requirements, which reference CIS Top 20 version 7.1 framework. Will there be a mapping on controls across different frameworks? Yes, as a matter of fact, there already is a mapping within the CMC to the different frameworks on which they've pulled controls from. And I know that with the CSF, that's been mapped across various standards. And I would assume that, in similar way, they'll be doing the same thing with CMMC to see which ones apply. But right now, those are actually within the standard itself. They have the mappings from which they've taken the controls or have mirrored a particular control or taken insight from a control.
And I think to that end, whenever, because we get asked a lot about mappings and kind of cross compliance or universal compliance. And one of the things is, a direct mapping is of course different than a kind of relationship or a reference. And so, especially when you start to consider scoping and different environments and kind of what standards and frameworks apply to what data, a lot of these mappings can sometimes give a false sense of security, no pun intended, but only because they don't directly map one-to-one, even if they're kind of a similar theme. And so on, a lot of these mappings that I've seen, there's, it tends to fall into a number of buckets. One is things that are almost exactly the same and do map about one-to-one. And then things that, sometimes it seems like a little bit putting a round peg in a square hole to try to get, two controls from two different standards to kind of line up together and be mapped together. So I think just always the caveat is just be careful with any mapping, just to make sure that you kind of really understand the spirit and the scope applicability of those controls.
Great. How far into a DoD supplier supply chain is adoption of CMMC to be mandated, especially very small business sub-suppliers? Also, what about applicability to foreign sub-suppliers?
So my understanding of this is that it's in some ways a train the trainer approach. It's kind of in terms of it'll in the way that it's intended to roll downhill, it'll theoretically everything will be in scope. Now, what actually gets audited will probably be a pretty slow roll in terms of starting with the biggest, riskiest stuff and then slowly moving from those big risky things to additional sub suppliers and things like that. But as far as the technical letter of it goes, my understanding is that if you have CUI or theoretically are responsible for a product that helps to protect CUI within a government agency, then this is theoretically applicable to you. But in terms of very small businesses and sub-suppliers, we can cover this a little bit in the tips and tricks section a little later on. But I'll touch on it just very briefly now. There's an instinct for a lot of organizations to say, oh, well, I have CUI and I use these 50 very small vendors to help source my product. So what I'm going to do is just send all of them a blanket template letter that says, hey, if you get CUI, you have to do this thing, right? And that happened all the time from NIST 171. And I'm sure most of the people listening to this have seen those forms. And one of the best tips that I can give, and we'll touch on it again later because it's so important, is to really challenge your customers to a large extent to understand directly what CUI they believe they're giving you. Because in a lot of cases, what we found is organizations that are being told they probably have CUI from their clients actually don't. So we'll dig into that a little more later, but But that's my thought there. And in terms of applicability to foreign sub-suppliers, I believe it is applicable to them. It'll all be handled through the contract chain and flow downs. So Alex, Steve, anything you want to add to that?
I think another point kind of to the initial question is it's really about the data and not necessarily the size of the company. And so if you just think of kind of if you have the CUI, whether it's me, building some component in my basement, myself, and I've got $12 in my checking account. If I have that CUI, I mean, it could be the same CUI that, a multi-billion-dollar company has. And so the requirements are really kind of around, the data, more so than, just the size of the company. So it's something to keep in mind. I've had a number of conversations as this has all been kind of rolled out and talked about with, very small suppliers that, end up having, some pretty sensitive data. And, they're concerned that, it may be too expensive or onerous, to implement some of these things. And continue to be involved in these contracts. So it's certainly be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah.
Just a couple more, and then we'll move on. I see a few we'll definitely get to. So that, keep them coming. But the next one is if you have contracts with the DoD for supplying parts that are the same as over-the-counter parts, but contain different serial numbers for DoD purposes, would you be subject to this? Also, if you supply DoD specific parts to a supplier under DoD contract, would you be subject to this?
My understanding of this, and I would absolutely check this understanding with counsel, because I am not a lawyer. However, and check it for your contracts as well, and your contracts with your vendors. But my understanding is if it's the same as an over-the-counter part, then the answer is no. You would not need to worry about these items. But again, it's in some ways less about parts and more about data. And again, this gets back to my point in terms of often or potentially challenging your customers in terms of what specifically is CUI. Because in NIST 171, there was a specific exception for commercial off-the-shelf parts. And so if you have a customer who is saying, hey, here are all these specs, we want you to build this thing. By the way, it's the exact same as a commercial off-the-shelf thing, but we think you have CUI. Then the question becomes, oh, okay, well, what in this do you believe is CUI? And again, to Alex's point, because it's about following the data, ideally what happens in that situation is they say, yep, you're right, there's no CUI here, and now you don't need to worry about it anymore. So my understanding is just a serial number alone is not enough, but that's primarily because it's not about products themselves, it's about the data that you have, and challenging and making sure you have a really granular and clear understanding of the data that you do have and what is CUI is paramount to that.
Okay, great. So moving on to, maybe we can get back to a few slides and we'll get a few more questions in towards the end.
Great. So Alex, you want to talk a little bit about CMMC versus 800-171?
Absolutely, and because we're using Zoom, I have to use the, I was actually speaking while on mute, which is I think a standard, one of those standard Zoom phrases that we've all become familiar with, so I apologize for that. But one of the questions we're getting asked a lot is the difference between the CMMC and 800-171. And, a lot of organizations are asking us if they're compliant with 800-171, are they going to be in good shape for the CMMC? The first thing, I just want to point out too, though, don't forget that, with 171, just in the world of self-attestation is a very different world than, third-party attestation. So just because you have the 800-171 elements there, according to self-attestation, that line up to the CMMC, it doesn't necessarily mean that a third-party attestation is going to, or audit's going to show you the same thing. So always keep that in mind. But with the different levels of the CMMC, you're going to see a lot of, overlap with level 3 is going to cover, 800-171. But also some additional domains. So, the recovery, asset management being called out more specifically, and situational awareness. And, a lot of these things are going to be very familiar with people that have worked with the CSF or some of the other NIST standards. So no real surprises there, but, certainly something to think about. moving into the higher levels, level 4, looking a lot more at, how you're doing your metrics, how you're detecting and responding to advanced persistent threats and things like that. And then level 5, getting more into the optimization. We talk a lot about existence versus effectiveness and what that means for maturity. And so, this is one of those areas that, as you move forward and become more mature, it's not just going to be about the existence, but also the effectiveness and kind of the ongoing review. You go to the next slide. So another thing that we talk a lot about is certified versus compliant. And, I'm not real fun at parties, but that's the kind of subject that we enjoy kind of talking about and delving into. And again, one of the things that's going to be very different with this is that it's going to be the third-party assessment. And there'll be a lot of different issues with that, especially for these organizations, as I said, that are used to self-assessment. And, in my experience, and I've been doing this a long time, a lot of times when self-assessment answers are not necessarily correct or thorough, it's not malice. It's sometimes it can be a lack of understanding of the spirit of the control or things like that. So it's going to be very different, with the third parties, coming in to do this. There's been some guidance out of the government, very clearly, saying that no one is certified yet to do these assessments. But they are encouraging, pre-assessments and consulting using the most recent version of the standard. And so that's something that's important for any organization out there, whether you're using a third-party security company or doing it yourself, is really kind of getting into the CMMC and understanding your scope and, what the requirements are going to be, so that as we move further along through this, that you're really going to be ready. Next slide.
So the system security plan, I just wanted to drill down on this for a second because it does have some different components and things that are probably a little bit different than most folks who haven't been dealing with 871 have been dealing with. And the system security plan is really the background of your system. So who's in charge of it, what's done, who's in control, who's doing what, from a very high level. It's those collective details of the posture and the profile of the systems and how well you're tracking changes. Do you know that there have been changes made, for example? So you'll need things like a diagram or a graphic that shows the system boundaries, where it's interconnected, what are the devices within it, that type of thing. And so as opposed to a POAM, which is more like the honey-do list, here's all the things that we need to do. It's a long to-do list with other details, as it said, so milestones. So the plan of action, you would expect that to reduce over time. So you have so many things that you have to do, and over time that's gonna, you're gonna get things done. You're gonna check off that honey-do list, and it should get smaller and smaller. Whereas the system security plan, it's going to be more detailed, inclusive. It's going to continue to grow as your organization grows, as you develop new things, as you bring things into your systems. It's meant to be an iterative document that again will document any changes or areas that you're needing to know about or others should know about within your organization, so everyone can define what it is. You might have things that aren't implemented. So you'll have to show some high-level details because sometimes, for certain reasons or because of a particular system, you're not able to get things done. So they want to make sure that you have that documented, sort of what is the time frame, just, do you have a time frame, where is it, and what's going to happen for it. So then really when you get into it, the next question is, what should you certify? What is that system or group of systems that we're talking about?
And I think that's really an essential question. As Rick mentioned earlier, sometimes, as the contracts flow down, it tends to be kind of almost a reaction just to kind of pass the requirements along. But what's really important is to understand what data you actually have and what's going to be in scope. We worked with a number of organizations on other standards, 171, and things outside of this, HIPAA and PCI, and the key word is really scoping. And so a lot of organizations, look at this and ask, do we need to certify the whole company, or are we certifying an environment? And obviously there's a huge difference in cost and effort. So ensuring that you really understand what data you have and where it is. We're really big on data flows. So understanding your requirements from that perspective, where is this data actually sitting, and who's accessing it, and how are they using it? So that, if you need to implement controls and it's going to cost you a lot of money, making sure that you're focusing on the actual scope and not just trying to cover everything. So that's something that's extremely important. Obviously from a compliance standpoint, we're looking at the data and where it sits, but really step one is to just understand where that data is. And also, as we discussed earlier, with any vendor relationship, and at its core, that's what this is understanding, is it really required? I have a lot of different conversations with organizations that are have certain requirements pushed onto them contractually or for whatever other reason. And when we kind of dig into it, we realize that either they don't have that data, or it's very limited, or it's in very limited places. And so we're able to really just focus on that and make sure that we're spending efforts and working on compliance specific to the actual scope. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
So in terms of some tips and tricks, not to beat the drum too hard on data, but it really is a data-driven compliance framework. And again, if you've done NIST 171 or you're familiar with it, there's not a heck of a lot of difference if you're trying to get to right around level 3, and even beyond that. I mean, that'll cover a lot of the CMMC itself. So largely, if you're already familiar with that or doing that, this is largely going to be an exercise in documentation and control geography. But if you're not, some things you absolutely want to do or be thinking about. Again, challenge, your vendors, your customers on the CUI that they say they're sending you. I can't stress this enough, because the whole premise of the CMMC is to make sure that contractually the obligations, flow down from organization to organization to organization. So if there's a chain of 6 organizations deep that go into manufacturing an entire thing for the DoD, and there's CUI at each step in that chain, each client and each vendor, each client should be requiring its vendors to certify against the CMMC as long as everyone's doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. So it should flow down all the way in the chain, and to make sure that you're not over complying or overacting to this requirement, it's absolutely crucial to make sure you understand what data that you have specifically. And I know for a lot of organizations, particularly if you're a manufacturer, that can be challenging given current business practices. So oftentimes it'll be a zip file with thousands of engineering documents, but ultimately you do need to get to the root of it to say, okay, well, within these engineering documents, there are, these 3 specs are actually CUI, or this budgetary information is CUI, or whatever that is, so that, you and your clients or you and your vendors can have that handshake and say, okay, so you promise you're going to protect this data based on the, based on the stuff, because within the CMMC is vendor stuff, right? So part of this obligates you to obligate your vendors, to flow it down to your vendors. So knowing where the data is, what the data is completely crucial. And once you know what you're getting, you have to understand how it flows through your systems, flows through your environment, so you can make those calls that Alex was talking about before in terms of certification. Don't put the cart before the horse, right? So if you know that you're pretty weak right now on asset management, knowing your environment, knowing how sensitive data might flow from place to place, get started on that. Get started on inventories, get started on that kind of thing. So, because all this other stuff is really predicated on having good inventories, a good understanding of data flows, that sort of thing. Getting started assessing early, we touched on it before, you cannot actually certify now The infrastructure in place to do those certifications just doesn't exist, but readiness assessments and things like that, whether they're internal or going to a third party to help with that, can absolutely be done now. And be thinking about your staffing levels as well, because in some cases, say you have a business process where a zip file from a vendor is sent to 10 different departments in your organization because there's a little bit of marketing and a little bit of engineering and a little bit of software development. Ultimately, that information needs to be restricted on a least access basis. So you might need to implement some business process changes in order to minimize the scope of the environment that you need to certify. And doing all that and thinking through all that might require additional staffing in some cases, depending on your current state. So you really want to be thinking about those staffing levels as well. I'm going to throw up the next slide really quickly. Just other things to be thinking about in terms of remote handling of CUI. Given the pandemic, everyone's working remotely. So none of this on the slide is new, but it's just, quick reminders as we're talking on it. CUI shouldn't be on personal systems. So if, people are working from home and they happen to copy something onto their home PC, that really shouldn't be happening. Keeping printing and hard copy storage to a minimum. A lot of people's home offices are not necessarily as secured as the office environment. It doesn't have to be quite as secured, but if they're handling a high volume of very sensitive stuff, you probably want to think about getting them a shredder or making sure that they're reminded periodically about, the do's and don'ts. Using virtual desktops and things like that where possible absolutely is a great idea. And then, making sure that things, CUI stays out of personal email accounts, personal Dropbox accounts, all those other things so that you can, really draw those control boundaries around the scope of your environment. And whether we're working remotely or in the office, those requirements don't change. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about them, keeping them top of mind, and making sure your employees are keeping them top of mind as well. So should we throw up a couple additional questions, you think?
Yeah, we got quite a few. So so again, I think one of the keeps coming up, how far down the supply chain is this going to affect? So
I guess from my perspective, the letter of the law is everywhere the data goes should be affected by this, whether it's a tiny supplier or a huge supplier. Now, the reality of it is, I would be surprised if within 6 to 9 months or whenever they actually get the certification process figured out, those tiny organizations will be impacted by audits. I'm not promising anything. I don't have any special information, but just the way these things generally roll out, it's usually a risk-based approach in terms of who gets audited first, or if there's a problem, obviously that puts a target on your back. But technically, as soon as the thing is official, my understanding is it's applicable to the entire supply chain if you have the data. So the other potential scope limiting thing there is if your customers are sending you CUI that you don't need to perform the service, get them to stop. Because theoretically you'll be in scope and you'll want to, get that out of scope if possible.
Yep. So, I guess continuing on that, again, one of the questions is I've heard that contracting officer for the DoD contract will be making a decision on whether the contract has CUI and will require level 3 CMMC. And so I definitely say that's true, but again, for most of the organizations that work directly with the DoD, they're going to be, they're going to be very familiar with it. I think basically what you've said, Rick, talks about, again, those ones down the line. I don't know if there's anything else you had to add to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the contract says that, yes, it does require, CMMC compliance, that's great. But if that goes to a main contractor and that main contractor has 12 subcontractors working on components of it, each one of those components may or may not also require CMMC based on the data. And if you're a main and the contracting officer says that, yes, this is a CMMC related contract, it's also worth finding out from the contract officer potentially, why is it CMMC? What data specifically makes it CMMC? Because again, some of these processes, some of this stuff is going to be new for some individuals. And you just want to make sure that there's really clear alignment between the person giving you the data and you receiving the data to say, what do I need to protect and how do I draw that scope? So it's within everyone's best interest. And frankly, if you can limit that scope down and you can convince someone that actually, yeah, this does not need to be CMMC, compliant, well, that's great, because that's theoretically one less potential audit on the books that someone else has to do.
And I think the short answer is that it's going to flow down as far as the data flows down.
Yeah.
And, again, just in our experience, seeing a number of organizations, that may be set up in a, think back, in a strip mall storefront that are, making some element of a weapon system. And so, I think it's just going to continue to flow as far as the data goes.
Right.
So what about question 2? Should the information systems that we sell to the DoD implement the technical control practices in the CMMC?
So my understanding is going to be yes, if it's protecting or managing CUI, but that should be detailed by the DoD in the contract for related to the product itself.
On the April 17th webinar, Katie Arrington was on there and said she is not, she's one of their experts, said not to do or spend money on a pre-audit. How do you feel, how does one feel confident that they will pass the CMMC the first time?
So I would speak to that, and I would say I absolutely understand, her concern with some of that there, because there are a number of consultancies and vendors out there that are kind of offering a lot of services around this, already. But, it really comes down to, with any compliancy, whether it's PCI or HIPAA or CMMC or whatever else it might be, it really depends on, what you feel your capabilities are.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been, working in the compliance environment for a long time and feel you have a really good handle on it and you really understand the standards and things like that, then that might absolutely be correct. But for a lot of organizations, I think having that third-party view, because again, if you're used to self-attestation, a third-party assessment can just be very, very different. And when it comes down to evidence requirements and things like that, and what you're documenting and what's there, I kind of liken it to if you're going to put your house on the market. It can make sense to, have a home inspector come in and tell you what the home inspector is going to find, so you can, be ready to address those things. So I think that, again, while I understand, that statement, I think it really depends on the organization and its maturity and its capabilities. And, for a lot of organizations, I, obviously we're consultants, so, but, it's something that can be extremely helpful to, help you figure out, where you're sitting and how ready you are and, what's likely going to happen. What you don't want is to get to the point where this is required and you find out on the third-party assessment that you really don't have any of that stuff in place, and it's going to cause you business issues.
Yeah, and the other thing, just to add to that, my understanding of a lot of that commentary is that it was related to, if I recall correctly, some organizations that were saying, or that were maybe not saying explicitly, but implying that, oh, well, we can get you pretty much everything but the final seal of certification as part of this audit. And their perspective was more like, well, it's still draft. We don't even know the level of rigor that we need to put into certification, all that stuff. So don't trust anyone that tells you they can make you compliant. And that I completely agree with. But to Alex's point, if you feel you have a great understanding already of the things you need to do to get, to address the requirements in the draft, and you have a good understanding of your environment, all that stuff, then frankly, I wouldn't spend money on getting an assessment to tell someone something, or to have someone tell you something you already know. But if you feel like, well, we would love an external set of eyes to evaluate us against what's in the draft requirements, just so that we can start effort on the big things, and if they can help provide us insight in terms of some of the best ways to scope our environments or challenge our vendors or whatever that looks like, then that may or may not be money well spent. To Alex's point, it depends on your current capabilities and how confident you are in your picture of your business processes and your technical environment.
Talking about scope, is this going to be similar to a SOC 2? I can claim I'm SOC 2 certified even though my server closet is the only thing SOC 2 certified, or will the goal be to have this certification applied to the whole organization?
Well, I think that's kind of for the question is, the SOC 2 is, you're certifying the business processes that you want to certify, right? And then you can, use that for marketing or because it's contractual requirements, where this is around the CUI. So, to follow along with that, if your CUI is only in a closet, then there you go. But it's really going to be driven around, where the data is and how it's flowing and how it's managed in the organization. So it's a little bit different than, a SOC 2. The old auditing joke for ISO 27001. The fact that I know auditor jokes should probably tell you a little bit about me. But that was always the line is, you could, get an ISO registration for a closet, right? And so that was why it was always so important to look at the statement of applicability and see what the scope of that was. But because organizations are not defining their own scope in this as they would with ISO or as they would with a SOC 2, because the scope is defined by where the data is, that's kind of going to answer the question there. It's going to need to be around where the data is.
Right.
If you have data that is CUI, will the CMMC set standards on who in your organization can see, handle, and work on the data? Example, engineers. What if they're not U.S. citizens, or will there be a special certificate for similar to ITAR or compliance data access?
Oh, I love this question. So I believe, so it's sort of a yes and a no. There are definitely requirements in the CMMC that set standards on who can see, handle, and work on the data, specifically with respect to things like least privilege. If you have a zip file with 1,000 documents in it and 5 of those documents have CUI in them, but each of those documents really only needs to be seen by a different part of your organization, you're going to need a pretty strong defense to send that entire zip file to all of those individuals. Theoretically, you should be splitting up those individual files based on who actually needs to see them. So there are requirements around that from a business process perspective. From a citizenship perspective, I don't believe there are any currently, if I'm recalling correctly, but it's worth calling out that it is still in draft form, so things could change. I wouldn't expect that to change though, only because ITAR and actual classified information are intentionally more sensitive than the stuff we're talking about here. So I'd be somewhat surprised if a citizenship type requirement came up, and I don't believe there is one today, but it certainly is within the realm of possibility still because the thing's not quite finalized.
Is there a public list of the DoD supply chain? I've never seen one. I mean, again, there's 300,000, 350,000 of them, so I haven't heard of a full public list of DoD suppliers, all the way down. I don't know that there could be, unless you guys have seen anything else.
No, I haven't seen one. I mean, hopefully the DoD has one, but I don't know if there's a public one. And just to clarify on my answer before, yeah, when in doubt, explicitly deny access and only allow who needs access. And again, this is why it makes you just really got to know what data specifically is sensitive.
Yep. Yeah, and I just say, just to wrap up here, I've, in the whole time of all these different regulatory or contractual compliance and standards and regulations come out, it is almost always maybe less than a handful of folks that went through a readiness or some sort of pre-engagement, didn't find immense value in it. And there's so many questions that come up during it. To have to handle all that by yourself, as Alex always says, we see so many different environments. There's so many best practices and little things that you pick up. Rick had gone into, how to even set up a SIM better, how to, make that more affordable and better match your organization. So there's so many different little things that come up like that you might not know as an organization or someone else has seen that really have seen it extremely valued, from PCI, again, 15 years ago to 14 years ago when we really got involved in it to now. I mean, those types of things just are invaluable. Okay, anything else? Anything else that you guys have to say?
Not for me. This was fun. I appreciate the discussion, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks for joining, and thank you to Alex and Rick. we look forward to catching up the next time. Again, remember, our next webinar is the evolution of red teaming and pen testing with Dave Kennedy. So you definitely want to put that on your calendar and make sure you see it. Thanks again so much. Appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you soon.
Have a great day.
Everyone, take care.
Bye-bye.